There's a generation living in a gap that most cultural timelines forgot to map. Born somewhere between 1977 and 1985. They're too young to be Gen X, too old to be millennials, and too self-aware to pretend the distinction doesn't matter. They grew up analog, they graduated digital, and for their entire adult lives, they've carried a quiet, low-grade psychological weight that most frameworks don't have a name for. This is the psychology of Xennials, the micro-generation caught between two entirely different civilizations, and what that position actually costs the human mind. Here's what nobody tells you about people formed in a cultural gap. The displacement isn't superficial. It doesn't live in music preferences or phone nostalgia. It lives in the nervous system. It shapes how they construct identity, how they relate to ambition, how they experience belonging, and why. In rooms full of people, they often feel like the only one translating a language nobody else can hear. They grew up in a world with hard edges, childhoods with unstructured afternoons, no parental GPS tracking, the specific memory of being told to go outside and come back when the streetlights turned on. There was a particular texture to boredom back then. Long, slow, occasionally creative. They learned to sit with themselves before the internet gave everyone an escape hatch. A study published in the American Journal of Orthopsychiatry noted that by the mid-1980s, millions of American children between ages 5 and 13 were regularly unsupervised after school. That wasn't neglect. That was the cultural architecture of an era. And it wired something into them that neither the generation before nor the generation after fully developed. A tolerance for uncertainty, built not from therapy, not from a framework, but from Tuesday afternoons with nothing to do, and no one coming to fix that. Then the world cracked open. Their brains hold two incompatible acoustic memories: the grinding shriek of a dial-up modem connecting, and the sterile silence of a first iPhone screen illuminating. These aren't simply nostalgic artifacts. They are neurological evidence of a forced rewiring that happened during a critical developmental window. Neuroscientists studying brain plasticity in adolescence describe this period as a phase of heightened synaptic pruning, the brain aggressively reorganizing itself based on environmental input. For Xennials, that input arrived in two mutually contradictory waves. They didn't simply adopt technology. They became a living monument to the great digital fracture. Their neural architecture carries the scar tissue of that transition in ways even they rarely have language to describe. This is what researchers sometimes call cultural liminality, the psychological experience of inhabiting a threshold between two distinct social worlds, not native to either, fluent in both, and perpetually aware of the translation happening in real time. Psychologist Dan P. McAdams, who spent decades studying how people construct personal narrative and identity, found that individuals who experience significant cultural discontinuity during formative years develop a more fragmented self-story, not because they're weaker, but because the story contains more unresolved chapters, more contradictions that were never given permission to resolve. And the contradictions compound. At work, the pattern becomes almost mechanical. In a meeting full of boomers, they shift into formality, hierarchy, linear thinking. In a room full of millennials, they code switch into collaborative language, emotional vocabulary, horizontal structure. For the outside observer, this reads as extraordinary adaptability. For the Xennial psyche itself, it functions as something closer to an energy tax. Here's where it gets genuinely disturbing. Every time they translate between generational languages, every time they modulate tone, reframe expectations, adjust the frequency of their communication to match the room, they spend cognitive and emotional resources that should be funding their own self-definition. Psychologists studying identity development use the term identity foreclosure to describe what happens when external demands consume the psychological space needed for genuine self-construction. For many Xennials, by the time they reach their 40s, the accounting is stark. They've become remarkably effective functions in other people's systems and nearly invisible presences in their own lives. Efficient, indispensable, and quietly transparent. But here's something that emerges from the wreckage of that position. These are, by measurable accounts, among the most cognitively flexible adults in contemporary American life. Psychologist Adele Diamond, whose research on executive function and cognitive flexibility has been foundational in developmental neuroscience, describes cognitive flexibility as the brain's capacity to shift between competing frameworks without collapse. Xennials developed that capacity, not in a workshop, not from a book. They developed it under pressure, in real time, during a civilizational hinge point. That's not a small thing. That's a forge. They know what it felt like to be bored enough to invent something from nothing. They also know what it feels like to doom scroll at 1 a.m., while simultaneously remembering that the world once went dark at night and stayed that way. They hold both truths without needing to resolve them, not because they're at peace with the contradiction, but because they were built for exactly this kind of endurance. What was lost in that building is worth naming plainly. They grieve, quietly, the validation that never quite arrived. Gen X inherited the mythology of detached cool, the latchkey irony, the grunge, the knowing smirk. Millennials inherited the cultural reckoning, the think pieces, the therapy renaissance, the public permission to be wounded. Xennials inherited the gap, which turns out to contain some of the most psychologically complex real estate of the late 20th century. They just spent 30 years waiting for someone to come study it. Their survival became adaptability. Their in-betweenness became fluency. Their exhaustion became, against all probability, a form of intelligence. Nostalgic but unsentimental, analog in soul and digital in practice, effective in every room and fully at home in none. They've spent their entire lives building bridges between worlds that didn't ask to be connected. And somehow, without ceremony, without a cultural moment that said their experience counted, they kept building. If this analysis helped identify the mechanisms of your own displacement, subscribe. This channel doesn't deal in nostalgia. It examines how history fractures the human psyche and what gets built in the break. Leave your birth year in the comments if you found yourself in this fault line.